friends, welcome back to Food Prep Guide. We're back in the kitchen today with a food storage tutorial. I want to talk to y'all today about yeast. What sorts of yeast store well long term, how do we store it long term, and how to do this test to see if your old yeast is still effective before you don't want to waste dead yeast on a loaf of bread and waste all of those ingredients. So there's a little quick test that you can do to see if it is still good. Now, while we conduct this test, we're also going to be conducting an experiment because I have stored yeast that is 3 years old, so technically it's past its expiration date, and I have stored it 2 different ways, and I am very curious to know if one storage method is better than the other. So we're going to do a side-by-side experiment here, and I'll give you all the details. Let's get started. By the way, if you would like help building your food storage, scroll down to the description box of this video and click this link for our free 1-year food storage plan. We calculated a year's supply of food for one person, then broke that data down into a week-by-week list of items to build your pantry on a budget. We'll send it straight to your inbox. If you're new here, we invite you to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss all of our upcoming food preservation, pantry storage, and gardening tutorials. Now back to the kitchen. The type of yeast that I recommend for long-term food storage is this SAF instant yeast. Sometimes it's referred to as red instant yeast, but I have a feeling that the type of yeast isn't necessarily as important as the way that it's stored. I think the experiment will kind of give us a little bit more of an idea about that, but I think the important thing is that it's in these vacuum sealed little cubes. I purchased a pack of 4 in 2020, so these packages I have. This is the last of the 3rd package, and then I have my 4th package here. And I am very interested to see if it's still alive and if this vacuum sealed pack has any more effectiveness than this yeast that has been in my refrigerator, not airtight. This isn't a vacuum sealed jar. I'm in and out of it throughout the weeks, throughout the months. And we're going to do a test to see if it's effective. Now, you can use this test on any type of yeast and however how old it can be. So one of the things with expiration dates with food storage is that a lot of times it is a best by date and not necessarily an expiration date. Now, of course, that's not true for things like meats and milks and dairies and stuff like that. I am specifically talking about dried goods and canned goods. And that is going to be the case with yeast. It is a best by date, not an expiration date. So even though this is almost 2 years past its expiration date, I think we're going to see that it's probably still good. So the test that we're going to do is, since we're doing an experiment, I'm going to be using 2 different jars. But if you're just testing your yeast, you can just use one jar and just do this one time. So I need a 1/4 cup of warm water. We're just going to put a 1/4 cup of warm water in each jar. You want to test the warmth of your water just like you would a baby's bottle, so just dropping a few drops on your wrist, and you want it to feel warm. And to that, we're going to add, I'm just going to be doing a teaspoon of yeast. Ideally, you're going to be using the same amount of yeast that you would in a loaf of bread, and that is typically 2 1/4 teaspoon. Because this is the last I have, and I really want to experiment to see which storage method is best, I only have about a teaspoon, so that's what I'm going to be using. Okay, so this is the non-vacuum sealed glass jar in the fridge from 2020, so I'm going to put that here so we can identify which jar is which. And then I'm going to open up, I want to activate them at the same time, so I'm not going to activate them yet until I can get, whew, very good seal. Do you hear that? Hear that psh noise? This thing was good and sealed even almost 4 years later. Okay, so keep things nice and controlled, I'm going to do a teaspoon of this yeast as well. And here's our label. This is the vacuum sealed package that has been stored in the fridge since 2020. Next, we need to activate it with our sugar. So we're going to do, if you were using 2 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, you would use 1 teaspoon of sugar. Since I'm only working with 1 teaspoon of yeast, I'm going to half that and do half a teaspoon of sugar. Okay, they've both been activated at the same time. Now I'm going to get a spoon and stir it. And remember, the whole point of this little experiment is to see if the vacuum sealed packaging has any more of a preservation type. Let me wipe this off. I don't want to mess up my control. But if the vacuum sealed package has any more of a preservation effect on yeast than just having it in the fridge in an open glass container. And remember, this is the test that you would use for your yeast, just regular whatever yeast you have, to see if it's still effective before you bake your loaf. So now we're going to set a timer for 10 minutes. Before I do that, I'm going to mark a line. I'm going to use this little Sharpie and I'm going to mark a line where the water level is on both jars. Okay, I've got my black lines. I'm going to set my timer for 10 minutes. Time is set. So now what we're going to do is we're going to come back in 10 minutes. And if this yeast is still really good, ready to go to make a loaf, it should double in size. So we put a 1/4 cup of water. It should end up with a 1/2 cup of liquid by the time that we're done. But we should be able to visually tell that without measuring by just looking at the black line that we drew and see if it doubled in size. So we'll be back in 10 minutes. It has been 10 minutes, and as you can see, we are nowhere near doubled. So what this means is that this yeast is not very active. Is it completely dead? Do I have to throw it in the trash can? I'm not sure yet. We're going to continue with our experiment. So one thing that can happen with yeast is that it can kind of go to sleep in a way, and just to where that it doesn't grow as fast whenever it's activated. And that might be what's happening here because the yeast is old. And I am trying to prove to myself and my storage plan how long can I keep yeast, and therefore how much do I need to buy at a time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a timer. I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to change anything to these jars. I'm just going to set a timer for 10 minutes more, and we're going to check the levels at that point, and then we'll talk about what we're seeing. Okay? See you back in 10 minutes. It has been 10 more minutes, and as you can see, we have a lot more action going on now. I'm going to get up very close. I've already taken my markers and drawn lines at where they were at the top. You can see that this one over here, I just drew this line about 30 seconds ago, and it has already risen a little bit more. So let's talk about what this means. Let me show you an above view. Now notice that both of them are bubbling and foamy looking at the top. Yeast that is completely dead and cannot be used to make a loaf of bread rise is not going to foam and bubble like this. So both yeast controls, or whatever you might want to call that, are still usable. Both of these yeasts would still make a good loaf of bread. But the yeast in the vacuum sealed container that is almost 4 years old has more activity than the open jar in the fridge that has been open for, I transferred that from the freezer. Oh yeah, that's another note. Both of these have been frozen in the past. When I purchased those almost 4 years ago, I put them in the freezer and only kept one container in the fridge. And then when that one was getting low, I would take one from the freezer and put it back in the fridge. So both containers have been frozen for probably at least 2 years, both forms of yeast. But this one has been in an open jar for at least a year. And this one has been vacuum sealed the whole time. So as you can see, the vacuum seal is much more active. So let's talk about, let me get you back on the stand and let's talk about it. A few key takeaways that I take away from this test is that it is important to keep yeast vacuum sealed. So now that this container is open, I am going to go ahead and refill my open refrigerator jar, and I'm probably only going to fill it about halfway instead of fully. And then I'm going to go ahead and re-vacuum seal this with my Food Saver vacuum seal machine and put that back in the fridge, back in its vacuum sealed format. Takeaway number 2 is that old or expired yeast can still be used. We just need to make amends for it. So this yeast that is almost 4 years old, it took twice as, this one's breathing. It's like going up and down now. That is so funny. Oh man, it's literally going up and down, and that is the vacuum sealed package. So it is no doubt very active 4 years later. So vacuum sealing is key to making yeast storing yeast long term. But I just want to note that the active test of testing if yeast is active is typically you're only going to do that for 10 minutes, and if it doesn't double in size with 10 minutes, it's not considered active. But as you saw, I put on 10 extra minutes for a total of 20 minutes, and now my yeast is perfectly active and absolutely can be used in a loaf of bread. If I had just done that 10-minute test and didn't see that it had doubled in size, I could have thrown away this entire container thinking it was dead and wasted all of that yeast. So if you do the test and it doesn't double in size, go ahead and add 10 more minutes for 20 minutes total and see what it does. And if it still isn't doing anything at that point, go ahead, mark her down. The yeast is dead. It's not going to be usable. But if it does double in size after 20 minutes, then what you'll need to know is that when you go to bake your loaf, a lot of recipes will say to mix your yeast with warm water and sugar and let rest for 5 minutes. So when you go to make that loaf, just know that you need to let yours rest for 10 to 15 minutes, or proof for 10 to 15 minutes instead of just 5. That's all that one means. And then you can use that old expired yeast that is still perfectly good. Okay, y'all, I hope that was interesting. It was certainly interesting to me, and now I know I need to not store quite as much in an empty container, and I need to reseal my packages, vacuum seal them again, and put them back in the fridge. And that's what I will do from now on. See y'all next time. Bye.